Since the COVID pandemic's onset, that was 4 years ago now, finding a rental property in Australia has become as challenging as snagging a seat at the AFL Grand Final, hasn't it? Rental availability has plunged, the rents in our capital cities have skyrocketed, in some cases a staggering 30-40% in a couple of years. Now, the national vacancy rates nudged up slightly in some locations over the last couple of months, but it's still a far cry from the 2 to 3% that we'd be calling a balanced market where supply meets demand. And this scarcity has become a headache for tenants who are grappling in a highly competitive market. What's slipped under the radar of many people was that late last year, there was a Senate inquiry into our rental crisis. It made some recommendations, but it was a waste of money, according to my guest today, Nicola McDougall, Chair of the Property Investment Professionals of Australia. So as a property investor or somebody interested in property, I'm sure my chat with Nicola will be of interest to you as we discuss the inquiry, the state of our rental markets, and what's likely to be ahead. So welcome to today's show.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
Did you know that last year there was a federal inquiry into our rental crisis? Following thousands of submissions from organisations and angered tenants, a report was released on the 5th of December last year, but it seemed to fly under the radar, getting very little attention. But when it was released, my guest today, Nicola McDougall, Chair of the Property Investment Professionals of Australia, or PIPA, she said the report wasn't worth the paper it was written on. So what were the politicians' recommendations for our housing crisis, and what's ahead for property investors in the rental markets? That's what I want to check with Nicola McDougall today. Hi, Nicola.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for having me on the show again.
It's always fun speaking with you, and I know you have a good overview of what's happening in our property markets as the chair of PIPA. But let's first talk about this report. What was the purpose of the inquiry? What were they looking into?
Look, they were looking into the worsening rental crisis. That was actually the name of the Senate inquiry that took place over several months last year. They obviously called for submissions from, everyday people, investors and people that worked in the real estate sector, I suppose. But I just wanted to say something in relation to your intro, Michael. Not many people know this, but I actually was the one that broke the story about the Senate report having been released, because I actually was waiting for it to come out as well. And after the Christmas holidays, I was thinking to myself, surely it's been released by now. Anyway, so I went looking for it, and I actually found that it had been quietly uploaded to the website in December. And I sat there and I went searching for media coverage, went searching for a whole bunch of stuff, and it wasn't there. Reached out to a journalist friend of mine a couple of days later, I think the next day, and sort of said, did you know about this? And this person does a lot of reporting in our space, didn't know anything, and there had been so they'd quietly uploaded it and hoped that no one noticed, I think.
It's interesting. There's a lot of inquiries and discussions about housing shortage, immigration, rental crisis, lots of lip service, lots of talk. We're not seeing any action. This is even less action. Who made up the committee? Who eventually gave the report?
Well, it was a Senate inquiry, Michael, so it was a variety of senators across all political persuasions. So you had coalition senators in there, Labor senators, and it was actually chaired by Australian Greens Senator Janet Rice. So you did have, senators from across the political spectrum involved in that inquiry. As you say, there seems to be a lot of proposed reforms and or inquiries into some issues, which I kind of feel, politicians are wanting to be seen to be doing something, but they're actually in reality not doing much at all.
Well, I find it interesting that it was chaired by a Green senator because...
Actually, sorry, Michael, it might have actually been the Greens who actually proposed to look into it. So perhaps it was, that would make sense why they had a Green senator as the chair, that they were, the ones going seemingly on the front foot. Well, we need to look into the worsening rental crisis here in Australia. Let's have an inquiry sort of thing.
Well, the Greens are the ones who've been proposing rental freezes, rental caps, and in my mind, creating a bit of an us and them mentality, which I haven't seen in all my years in property. Tenants need landlords, landlords need tenants, and if we treat them each side with respect, as we have for decades, centuries maybe, it would work. But there seems to be a movement to create conflict, which is a shame. So what did PIPA, in your role as the Property Investment Professionals of Australia, propose? What did you suggest to the inquiry?
Yeah, because we produced a submission for the inquiry, a very significant one, as did many other property associations around the nation. I mean, some of our key recommendations to the inquiry was an end to legislation amendments that disincentivise property investment, including changes to taxations and other charges across all tiers of government, more investor positive conversations around housing supply, such as, proposals suggesting moves as rent-free caps, increased taxation for property investors clearly are severely damaging to our sector. Also, we, requested more engagement with bodies representing investors in the property investment sector prior to setting policy. Governments also need to be aware of how intervention into legal agreements between investors and tenants, such as leases, are eroding confidence in the sector. So they were just some of the recommendations that we made in our submission to the inquiry. We actually produced a number of submissions into rental reforms last year on behalf of PIPA, including for the proposed Queensland rental reforms and those in New South Wales as well.
Some people would say PIPA has got a vested interest. You're representing investors or the real estate industry, and that's true, just like others represented their constituents. Who else made submissions, and what recommendations did they come up with?
Look, I mean, there was hundreds and hundreds of submissions, and the inquiry actually had public hearings as well, held in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane last year too. What I did feel, though, from the volume of submissions that were produced did seem to be a significant amount from representing the tenant side of the equation, such as your tenants' unions, a number of bodies that are actually funded by state governments. So there did seem to be quite lopsided in regards to who produced submissions. Clearly, in industry bodies such as ourselves, real estate institutes, the likes of the Housing Industry Association, Master Builders, the Property Council, certainly produced submissions representing the property sector. But unfortunately, I feel that not only the number of submissions, but I believe that the number of people that were invited to speak at the public hearings were significantly from the tenant side of the ledger and not from the property sector. And I did listen to a few of those public hearings when they were available to stream live, and there did actually seem to be that way. A huge number of people representing tenants, even tenants themselves, and very few, like for example, PIPA didn't get invited to appear at the public hearings, nor did our sister association, the Property Investors Council of Australia. And one would think if you were doing an inquiry into the rental crisis that you probably should speak to the associations that represent the people that supply 80 to 90% of rental accommodation in this country, but they didn't.
Well, let's put some perspective here. There's about 7 million Australians, just under 1 in 3 people who live in rental accommodation. There's 2.1 million Australians who've stepped up to provide 91% of that rental accommodation around the country. Now, each year the tax department releases statistics on how many property investors there are. And we've spoken about it before, Nicola. 92% of them own 1 or 2 properties. 72% of them own less than 100,000 a year. They're not tycoons. They're your neighbours, your friends, your family. Now, the landscape's evolving. A lot of property investors have been stepping out of the market, and we'll talk about that in a moment if you've got time, because of some of these challenges. So, therefore, there's millions of people on the other side providing, in Australia, accommodation, providing a service, running small businesses that in other countries the government would be doing.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really frustrating, Michael, whether it's this, Senate non-inquiry or whether it's proposed rental reforms following, the collection of submissions from associations such as ours that tend to just disregard everything that we have said or recommended in our submissions. So it is very frustrating from an industry point of view that whilst it's great to have a seat at the table, supposedly. It does seem to me that there is an element of lip service or smoke and mirrors here where, whether it's state governments or this Senate inquiry need to be seen by the public to be engaging with both sides of rental accommodation, which is investors and tenants, as you've mentioned. And as I always say, it's a symbiotic relationship. It seems to me that they're not actually taking into account anything that we're recommending or even respecting the fact that we represent investors and the fact that we are, significant associations that have plenty of experience. And also not only that, but also, experience under our belts of seeing markets rise and fall, rental markets, tighten and loosen over the years. We have got runs on the board in regards to this versus politicians who may have only been in their position for a few years.
So what were the final findings of the inquiry? Did they come up with any recommendations?
Look, it was quite interesting because when you actually read through the report, of which I did once I found it, because it's a Senate inquiry, it actually means that it didn't really have any final recommendations. Now, what does that mean? Well, the chair made in a broad sort of sense, there was a few recommendations, which was boosting the supply of public and genuinely affordable housing. Obviously, there was, a lot of information about that. Relief for renters, increasing renters' rights. So you're like, okay, well, that all sounds great. And as I was reading through the report, I'm like, okay, when I was originally reading through the actual body of the report, I'm like going, oh, well, this sounds all right. They even referenced PIPA a couple of times, which was good. But then when you actually came to the final recommendations from the chair of the Senate inquiry, and let's remember that the chair is from the Australian Greens, there in black and white was a recommendation to freeze rents for 2 years, followed by a limit of rental increases of 2% every 2 years. Also, that freeze and ongoing limits should be attached to the property, not the tenancy. It should be backdated. On top of that, there was a recommendation that the Australian government should coordinate with state and territory governments to remove no grounds evictions. And then also in the recommendations from the inquiry chair, it talked about the urgent reform of tax measures such as negative gearing and capital gains tax, which needed to be undertaken if the government was serious about fixing these issues. Now, Michael, when I saw this, I literally just nearly fell off my chair because I was like, hang on. These are all of the things that the Australian Greens have put forward as their policy positions, which the Australian government, the National Cabinet, several months before had indicated that they would not support. Yet here we were at the beginning of December with the chair of the Senate inquiry actually proposing recommendations which are clearly just taken from the Greens playbook and had already been knocked back by the Australian government.
Well, it's really good that it got knocked back. I was shivering as you were telling me these things. Of course, being in an election year in some sub-markets and the big election coming up again next year, you can't see the government introducing those. And they're not going to work. We've discussed it before. Rental freezes is going to actually have the opposite effect of what the Greens party want. And it's been shown overseas over and over again by just limiting the amount of accommodation available.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's why it was so surprising to me when I read through the findings. I was like, well, these have already been thrown out. I don't understand. And that was when I really realised that the Senate inquiry was a waste of taxpayers' money and a waste of everybody's time. Because all it did was allow the Australian Greens to grandstand on policies that had already been shown not to have wider support from the Australian government. And it was, like you said it before, Michael, it was just another opportunity for them to create this us and them sentiment out there between investors and tenants, which doesn't help anybody. And then when I actually looked further into the report, as someone who hasn't really had a lot to do with Senate inquiries before, there was also recommendations from coalition senators and Labor senators separately, which were completely different to what the inquiry chair recommendations were. And that was the moment as well where I was like, okay, so there's no consensus here. The only consensus was the fact that we need to increase supply. Yes, of course, everybody bloody knows that. But the actual senators that were involved in the inquiry couldn't come to an agreement on any, recommendations apart from that one. And certainly some senators, blankly said that they did not support any moves to freeze rents and or limit rental increases. So It was an eye-opener, definitely. And that was also, a period of time where I actually debated it for about 24 hours and wondered what to do about it. And then I suppose you could say I leaked it to a well-placed journalist the next day.
Well done. So basically,
Thank
the
you.
rental inquiry was a waste of taxpayers' money that could have been spent more effectively helping people who needed it. Now, we know this rental crisis isn't something that's just cropped up overnight. It's slowly crept up, and it's due to lots of factors, including the trend towards smaller households that started over COVID. So we needed even more accommodation just for the same number of people. But this huge rebound in population growth, a shortfall in new construction, a slowdown in dwelling completions, but not to mention investors are cashing out at the moment and selling up their properties. Now, I know PIPA does an annual sentiment survey once a year, and your survey at the end of last year in 2023, I guess, showed in my mind, the staggering number of investors who left the market. We know that people come and keep, people go all the time, but maybe you could share with us the figures of the PIPA annual sentiment survey with regard to who left and why.
So our ninth annual survey last year, which we run in August every year, and for the second year in a row, we are really starting to drill down into investor sales activity, which we previously haven't been doing, because we've never had a rental crisis of this nature. So it helps everybody to understand what the heck is going on. And as you mentioned, Michael, the rental crisis didn't happen overnight. It took many, many years to occur, and probably started about 2015 with those APRA restrictions on investment lending.
Yes.
But our survey showed that a staggering 12% of investors sold one or more of their rental properties in the 12 months to August last year, which was actually slightly less than the previous year. But also the previous year, we'd asked investors what they'd done over the previous 2 years. So we will get some sort of data stability there going forward. So the year before, nearly 17% of investors had said that they'd sold at least one property in the previous 2 years. Now, by our determination, that's potentially hundreds of thousands of rental properties being stripped for the market. And we say that because the vast majority of those properties were not bought by other investors. They were actually bought by home buyers, upgraders, downsizers and things like that. So we can safely say that we've, had a significant reduction in the volume of investment properties that are available for rent around the country for the last couple of years. And last year, the number 1 and 2 states where investors have been selling were Queensland and Victoria. And not surprising, I guess, that those 2 states have been the locations where there have been some quite extreme rental reforms over recent times. And of course, as we've talked about before, Michael, the crazy Queensland interstate land tax, which came up in 2022, but certainly probably motivated some investors to sell in the months after that as well.
When you drilled down further, did investors give reasons why they were selling up, Nicola?
Definitely. And the results were quite interesting from last year's survey, because the number one reason that investors gave for selling one or more of their real estate assets in the previous 12 months was governments increasing or threatening to increase taxes, duties and levies that make property a less attractive asset to hold. Number 2 was changing tenancy legislation. So, the number 1 and 2 reasons why investors are selling, it's market intervention by governments. Let's be honest. They've had enough. Many of them are just feeling that they're losing control of their assets. Certainly when we've had these changes or threatened changes to rental legislation and or, the potential threat of rental freezes, the reduction in the number of times that you can increase your rent, all of these types of things, investors are really just, some of them are actually just saying, look, this isn't working for me anymore. So, that's the top sort of reasons why investors are selling. And I think that you and I have spoken about this before, Michael. I don't, educated investors shouldn't be selling. The market metrics are strong. Clearly, the metrics for investors holding over the medium to long term remain extraordinarily strong. We have an environment where rents have increased, but that's because they were pretty flat up until about COVID times. So those sophisticated
I think that's a really important point. Sorry
Yeah.
to overspeak you, Nicola.
Yeah, that's
But if
okay.
you look back over a decade, rents
Yes.
hadn't increased, hadn't even kept up with inflation.
No.
And yes, they have skyrocketed over the last couple of years, but so have a lot of other costs. So it's really supply and demand and market forces. It's not landlords being greedy, taking advantage of tenants like some parties with a particular colour are suggesting.
No, exactly. And there hasn't been a lot of media about the fact that rents actually fell at the beginning of COVID. And
You
so
and I
anyone who's
experienced that as investors, didn't we?
I know. And if anyone who's got a basic understanding of mathematics would be able to recognize that, the percentages that they've increased since then because they actually fell to start off with. And certainly in some states, rental growth was very benign. And in Queensland, where I own my portfolio, was very benign, actually went backwards for a number of years. So, as an example, one of my properties now, yes, the rent has gone up quite significantly over recent years, but compared to when I bought it 10 years ago, it might even be 11 years ago now, it's probably the rent might be up 20% in 10 years. We're certainly looking into that a bit more, and we have been on the front foot and trying to explain that to the wider market and to consumers and the media, and especially that, rents have gone through a period of rapid growth. They do seem to be moderating. The market will only bear what the market can bear, obviously, and we are starting to see, with high rents, which is always what happens, with higher rents, we start to see that new generation of home buyers begin, where they start to look at the data, or they look at the how much rent they're paying and going, well, you know what, I can actually afford to go off and buy a little apartment or a house or a duplex, whatever it means, and my mortgage repayments might be the same or whatever it might be, but the numbers start to make more sense to them and it motivates them to become homeowners, and that's a good thing, actually, isn't it?
Definitely. So it will change the way we live. There'll be more people staying at home before they leave home, mum and dad. There are also going to be people getting back to living in multi-generation households. There will be people sharing apartments. One of the other interesting trends that I've noticed over the last years is more the mum and dad helping kids out of rental accommodation and into buying their properties. Now, that's not available to everybody, and some people say the rich are getting richer doing that. But I think I love what PIPA is doing and what you're coming out in the media explaining, that property investment isn't a zero-sum game. It's not if I win, you lose. It's, in my mind, building a stable future for all Australians, tenants and investors alike. And if we foster a community where investment isn't seen as an act of greed, but a pillar to strengthen our economy, a social fabric, provide accommodation, because not all tenants are poor. A lot of people rent, and I know you at certain stages in your life when you went through moving to a different location, you rented for a while. We've all had to do that. So it's not, somebody has to provide this and the government's not.
Yeah, exactly. And, it's clear, unfortunately, that the system is broken. We need to have a stable supply of rental accommodation in this country, and we don't. We did for a long time. But I think it's a confluence of factors, as you mentioned during the show, as I've talked about on the record before, that, look, anything, whenever there's a disaster of any magnitude, and let's call it a rental disaster, there's a number of things that had to happen for, like a plane crash or something like that, for it to happen. And unfortunately, all of those things happened. And then probably the rotten cherry on the top was COVID. You know what I mean? And vacancy rates were falling before COVID. And then, perhaps if that hadn't have happened, we might have been able to dig our way out of it, but it did happen. And now we're left with the outcome, which is, a rental disaster around the nation. And the key, I was asked this question the other day, how can we fix the rental crisis? And it was like supply. I said, supply, investors, investors, investors.
So more supply. The government said we're going to build 1.2 million new houses. They're not going to build any of them. And they're probably not going to encourage developers to, until the value of new dwellings goes up, because they're not financially viable at the moment. And so the build to rent sector is only going to bring a small amount of new accommodation in. I think we're going to be talking about this for a few more years to come, Nicola.
I think it's one of those things, reversely, what comes up must come down. So what goes down must go up. And so if we actually truly believe that these issues started, let's call it 8-9 years ago, look, I'd hate to think it's going to take 8 or 9 years, but potentially, like, what are we at, 2024? So do we think that by 2020 we might have more of an equilibrium in the rental supply in this country by 2030, which is only 6 years away, which is kind of scary, which would have meant that we've had like this 15-year cycle of, a rental crisis that was created, a confluence of factors, but a lot of it was about market intervention. And as we know, Michael, anytime there's market intervention, they usually stuff it up.
Well, be aware of unforeseen consequences.
Yeah, that's right.
So, yes, I think there will be quite a number of years before this gets changed. Now, you're 100% right when you're talking about supply. Suddenly look after the investors, those creating the supply, give them certainty. I don't think we're asking for more tax breaks. We're not asking for anything unreasonable. But if people are going to make a large financial commitment, certainty, safety seems to be the thing they're looking for, Nicola.
Definitely. And long-term investments, it's difficult to keep your eye on the horizon when the rug is forever being pulled out from underneath you. And that is across a number of different ways. And it's so unfortunate, Michael, you've been doing this for a really long time. I've been doing it for a reasonably long time. But the political football that is property investment is not helpful. It doesn't give investors certainty. Unfortunately, property, is a very emotional, I guess, thing. I mean, it's shelter. Everyone needs somewhere to live.
Yes.
But over the years, I think it's getting worse, actually. As you mentioned with the Greens, it's become more and more a political tool to try to win points between, parties, or certainly in the lead up to elections. And so that is not helpful. We need a stable supply of rental accommodation, and investors deserve a stable period where, they're not going to be hit with changes to things with, whether that's residential tenancies legislation or federal legislation, which is going to impact their ability to hold that property for the long term.
So maybe we should finish off by saying stop picking on property investors and stop treating them like an ATM machine. Every time you need some more money, find a tax to pick on the investors, because, as you said, there's unexpected consequences. It flows through to the market, Nicola.
Exactly. And as we've seen over recent years with the PIPA Investment Sentiment Survey, so we'll be doing that again in August this year. Some investors have been voting with their feet because of all of these issues, and they're actually making the rental crisis worse. So this is the, a consequence of some of this market intervention that's happening, or even the threat of market intervention or changes. And we're seeing fewer and fewer investors holding on to their assets. But we've also actually seen a significant reduction in the number of investors entering the market, and that is just going to prolong the rental crisis.
Definitely. Well, thanks again for your chat, Nicola McDougall, Chair of the Property Investment Professionals of Australia. I'll leave a link to your survey if people are interested in having a look. I'll leave it in the show notes because I think it's got some enlightening findings. Catch up with you again soon. Thanks, Nicola.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you.
In a moment, I'm going to share with you my mindset message. But before I do, if you enjoyed the show so far, and you don't subscribe, and that seems to happen to a lot of regular listeners, just stop for a second, whatever podcast app you're listening to, just subscribe to the show. Hey, I'd really love it if you told somebody else about the show as well. We've had over 5 million downloads of the show over the years, but I want to get to a wider audience, and the best way of doing that is by people like you who get benefit from the show, just telling one other person about it, or even leaving a review. Now, before the mindset moment, I also want to maybe just share a little story with you, because it's about my least favourite donation that I guess I don't like giving. I consider myself a generous person. Actually, I consider my wife, Pam, to be one of the most generous people on earth. She loves to help those in need, and she's again running a charity ball later this year in Melbourne. She ran one in Brisbane last year. We love to help the ones that need the help the most. But there's one donation I have to make every year that I don't love. and that's paying my taxes. Now, I get it. We all need to pay taxes if we want to live in a livable society, and I'm more than willing to pay my share. I'm just not particularly confident that the government spends my money wisely, so I like to legally keep my tax to the minimum. Legally. This means I can give more to the ones who really need it. If you'd like to give more to those you'd like to help, even if that's you, and you're a property investor or a business owner who'd like to legally reduce your tax bill, then you really should join us at Wealth Retreat 2024 that we're conducting on the Gold Coast at the end of April. Now, by now you've heard me talk about this annual event, and you've probably even considered joining us. Well, now's the time to do it. When you come, you'll learn the way the elite property investors and business owners structure their affairs to protect their assets and safely grow their wealth to pass them on to future generations. And for many attendees, this is a tax deduction. Now, check with your accountant. I'm not giving you tax advice, so go to wealthretreat.com.au and check out the great faculty I've put together, an expanded faculty this year. Mark Bouris, chairman of Yellow Brick Road, is going to be the keynote speaker, and we've got all the regular people there, Andrew Wilson and Pete Wargent and Mark Creed and Ken Race. Stuart Weems and Tom Corley will be doing special presentations, Brett Warren, a lot of other people too. Now, history has shown us that at this stage of the economic and property cycle, that's when lifetime wealth's being created by those in the know. So don't miss this opportunity to learn the most advanced property, finance, business structuring, risk mitigation and tax strategies. Go to wealthretreat.com.au, register your interest in joining us, and I look forward to seeing you on the Gold Coast at the end of April.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In my mindset message today, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about survivor mentality. Now, I read this a couple of years, actually quite a few years ago, that in 1972, a plane flying from Uruguay to Chile in South America crashed in a mountain in the Andes. Apparently, this plane split in half. And over the next 72 days, a group of 33 survivors battled shock, frostbite, avalanches and starvation. At the end of the ordeal, there were only 16 survivors. So what kept these 16 people alive in their darkest hour? Researcher Spencer Harrison tracked down 4 of the survivors. He studied their journals and he even visited the crash site. And it turned out every survivor shared a common theme. And that was hope. The plane's radio was damaged, which meant they weren't able to send out communications, but they were still able to receive them. For the first few days, they stayed in the shelter of the plane and they waited for rescue. 9 days later, their supplies apparently were depleted and they were forced to feed off the flesh of the frozen bodies of their teammates who died. I'm sorry to say this, but this is what I read. On the 10th day, a few survivors heard over the radio the search had been called off. No one was coming to rescue them. Now, the captain said, we must not tell them that, at least let them go on hoping. During the long, cold and hungry days, the survivors prayed together. They planned what their life would be like after returning to civilization. One spoke of opening a restaurant, another dreamed of having a farm. Many wrote letters to their family declaring their will to live. We have to become alchemists, one of the survivors wrote in his journey, changing tragedy into a miracle, depression into hope, he wrote in his journal. What the researchers found was that believing in new possibilities prevents people from spiralling into despair and propels them to think of options. Psychologists call this grounded hope. If you take action, you can make things better. Now, the story goes almost 2 months after the crash, 2 of these passengers decided to take control. We're getting out of here on our own. They hiked 53 kilometres across tumultuous terrains for 10 days until they spotted a man on horseback. The remaining 14 passengers were shortly rescued by a helicopter. Many of the passengers had hope, yet sadly still lost their lives. So while hope isn't a strategy, it does enable you to be more optimistic, which means your brain works 31% better, giving you the ability to become more solution-focused. It means you focus on possibilities rather than probability. It means you find strength to move forward rather than staying trapped as a victim. So if you or somebody close to you is going through dark times right now, remember, Things get better when you get better. Forget about all the reasons why it won't work and focus on the one reason why it will. That can change your entire outcome. Well, thanks for spending the last little while with me, and I hope you got some benefit from this show. If you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcasts, there's 3 little buttons down the bottom. Press it and share it, or just tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you'll definitely be doing me a favour and helping me in my quest to make as many people as possible financially literate. Now, there's ways of catching up with me between these shows. Just look for Michael Yardney on social media, or why not join my private Facebook group? Go to Facebook and look for the Property Update Facebook group. And I have a way of saying thank you to you for subscribing to this podcast. Go to podcastbonus.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where you can get a bunch of ebooks and reports. My way of saying thank you. And when you've got time, why not listen to some of the old podcasts? There's individual lessons in each of those that I think would be helpful for you. I'll be back again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?